One of the most important economic subjects is usually the business cycle or the economic cycle. And this is pretty much talking about the boom and bust cycle of how economics works, of how economies work, and more specifically how markets work. So you've probably seen this that there's bull markets and there's bear markets, yeah. And there's often usually a crash, whether it's a stock market crash or real estate market crash that corrects the system and sort of resets the game back to zero, and then it all starts over. It doesn't usually get back to zero, but it sort of goes something like this. Yeah, boom and then bust, and then boom and then bust, and so on. And an analogy I like to use, actually, it's a quote. Yeah, it goes something along the line of tough times create tough men. Tough men create soft times create weak men, and these weak men in turn create tough times. I think this is a perfect analogy that simplifies a difficult financial subject, a difficult economic concept, and puts it into something that we can use in our day to day, we can see in our day to day. Because it gets very difficult to try and figure out, okay, where exactly are we on on history's timeline relative to, all the things that we see in the news and so on. It can be very difficult to project, to know how to go forward when you just look at the day-to-day news, when you're just doom scrolling on TikTok. But when you think of a simple analogy like that, then it becomes very clear that we're in the tough times section. And that's what this video is about. So when I was doing my research for the past 2 weeks, I've kept on looking at this graph. It's from the US, and it's just about the US labor participation rate and how it has been dropping for men from a high of 90 all the way to like 60. And, pretty much it was the opposite effect for women. And I couldn't, a part of me, to to this day, to right now, I really just can't figure out where a third of the male population just went. Because ignoring all the feminist crap, acquiring resources is a huge, pretty much the central part of being a man. So when I saw that the labor participation rate has literally just gone down, and the trend is continuing to going downwards, and this is not just an American situation. The same thing is happening in China. I've looked a lot into the whole line flat and let it rot concepts that have really just gone viral. And while everybody's taunting that China House is going to be the next powerhouse, a lot of them are not really looking at the fact that most of the youth, most of the young men have literally just kind of like, I don't know what the figures exactly are when I say most, but a great majority of the population, of the young male population, has simply just said that it's not worth it. And these are the workforce. These are the workers that you need to innovate and to build and to do a lot of the hard, nasty stuff that most other people, most other demographics don't want to do. So with that, and it's the same that is happening in Japan with the hikikomori, I think I said it right, situation. It's the same thing that is happening in South Korea with the, I think it's called the non-poor generation. I don't know how to say it, but same thing. No dating, no marriage, no kids, no house, no assets. All of that really been stripped down. So it's more of like just kind of like, what can we do about it? And if you remember, one of the greatest trends or highlights of the 2020, from the 2020s has been the quiet quitting trend. And it has really stuck. Up until now, it has really kind of like been a defining moment for Gen Zs, because it's almost saying that, you know what, we'll just do what is required, because at the end of the day, any hard work above a certain effort doesn't necessarily lead to more results. So because of that, I was looking at that, and I was looking at where we are in the business cycle. And that's when I kind of like came to the conclusion that we're in the tough time section. And so the notion that things are gonna just, readjust and get better without any changes is that's just crazy. That's just cope. Yeah, it's just a coping mechanism. What has happened right now, sorry, what is happening right now has been baked in from the very beginning. Now, there's this notion that things are supposed to get easier with time, that technology is supposed to get better and so on. And yes, that is true, but it also ignores what we've talked about in terms of the business cycle, because there has to be balance. Yeah. Everything in nature, just like everything in nature, everything in economics is about balance. It's about finding equilibriums. And because there has been so much waste, so much, greed and corruption over the past 50 years, and this is, everywhere in the world, but right now, let's just take a look at this country in particular. Because of that, we must pay for the consequences. Yeah. Now, this is really the hard thing, that even if it is not your fault, just because you are the one being handed over the baton in the business cycle, you have to deal with it. So when we look into history, a lot of people think that, oh, this country has always been shit, but it hasn't always been that way. I've done a lot of reading, and sure, every time period has its own issues. But when I looked at the pros and cons of the 1960s era, when independence was being handed down into the weak men, I could see from then on that the wreckage of institutions, the simple, things stopped working the minute these African leaders were handed the nation. When you look at Kenya as a colony, there's all this, oh, it was bad and life was bad and like all that. And that is true to some extent. But we have to look at the fact that it was everywhere, and there are other countries that were doing worse off. So, for example, okay, it's no longer a shocker that, Singapore was nearly poorer than us, South Korea the same, Japan was destroyed in World War II and they had to rebuild from scratch, Germany the same, actually Germany, most of Europe, Britain had just, they needed America to win the war, but even though they won the war, they were left, a shell of the empire there once was. Really, everyone around the world was in a tough situation, but they dug themselves out of it. When we look at Kenya, on the other hand, it was much more insulated. We didn't necessarily have to fight in World War II. We didn't necessarily have to, play all this geopolitical wars that were happening during that time. So Kenya was very much insulated, and it was actually a strong economy. Now that for me was a shocker, because we look at that time period and you look at all the things that make a strong economy. That when we're not just talking about business going on, we're talking about household formation, we're talking about a growing population, we're talking about the fact that exports were rising, all of these things, the institutions were working. And you can see that because for some period from now the 60s going on to the 70s and the 80s, there was still some residual effect. Yeah, I would say up until the 90s there was still some residual effect, because something like universities here, there were still strong institutions. When you look at the marketplace, probably the greatest job marketplace to have ever existed. When we look at the fact of the housing market, all of these things, the assets were there to be bought for cheap. Pretty much when you look at all of those were the good times. But here's the thing about the good times. We've said the good times create soft men. And now what happened is all these soft men literally just baked in, the glory of what the British had built over, let's say, half a century. And they used up all of the institutions, all of the power and all of the good things that were handed down to them without really thinking about the future. So pretty much this is what happens. Let's take university as an example. People actually used to get paid to go to university. This was a shocker for me. Yeah. And the meals are provided and accommodation, all of that. It was literally some first world shit that is happening in Kenya. Yeah. But the notion that we've always been a third world country and we've always been behind, you should abandon that because it didn't necessarily happen. What has happened is the mass degradation of the institutions and everything, of how the country runs. So we look at that, and it's not just universities, it's every other thing. It's everything from government, from business, from the fact that we had a thriving stock market from 1954, but then, all of these things were handed down to us, sorry, not to us, but to the weak men, and they just baked in these good times without necessarily planning for the future. So because of that, because of the greed, because it's just let me fill up my pockets and I don't care where the country goes, what happened is all the other tough men created by the tough times in Japan, in Singapore, in Dubai, in most of Europe, in Germany, all of them went into the business of building their economies. Yeah. I mean, even China, for the largest part during all of this, China was a sleeping giant. Yeah, it's only up until the 90s when China accepted capitalism, and I'm guessing it's Mao Zedong or something like that. I'm not sure of his name, but he pretty much said, I don't care whether the cat is white or black, I care whether it catches mice. And so China opened its borders, they took up, American business, they partnered with everyone, and they became the manufacturing powerhouse that they are today. The tough times that created the tough men led to the good times that they have right now. And so for us, you have to understand that it's quite the opposite. We're on the opposite end of the business cycle. And so because of all those policies, because of all the stealing and all the greed and all the stupidity over the past 50 years, it's 5 decades, actually it's 6 decades, yeah, since the 1960s, we're now in a situation whereby the younger people who are coming into this world, into this country, they're looking at all of this and they're saying, wait, why are we to blame? You're the ones who had it good and you ruined it, and now we're the ones all of a sudden to blame. And so that's why I'm actually making this video, because it really pisses me off every time I hear, oh, you young kids, oh, you Gen Z, and then they go on and say something that is totally, irrelevant, or does not have an ounce of critical thinking. Because we can see this just from a simple quote. We can break down what has happened to the economy over time, and we can now figure out where we are. So the sad reality of it, and this is the crux of the video, is that even if it's not your fault, it's your responsibility. So the harsh reality is that we are coming into probably the worst job market, the worst real estate market. Everything is just cooked. Yeah, I don't need to go into the specifics. Yeah, we can see it. If people are giving up on basic essentials, if people are giving up, yeah, if there are no jobs, if you can't start a business, if you can't even get a passport, yeah, even if you wanted to go out, yeah, everything has just skyrocketed. to the point where people have just decided that they're not going to have children anymore. But, online it looks like, oh, child free, all of this, dual income, no kids. All of that is just cope. It's a coping mechanism. But the best thing to do, or the only thing, let me say, is to realize where you are in the business cycle and act accordingly. Because the thing about tough times is that they create tough men. So what I would say is the primary strategy going forward. We don't know how many decades it's going to take to get us out of this situation. But the notion that this is all going to get better after 2027, or once we get, what, that notion is stupidity, because you're not looking at the history. You're not looking at what has happened since the 1960s, since when this country was handed down to us. And because of that, there's this belief in the Messiah. There's this African belief. We like to think of, I guess it's the analogy Chebo was kind of like looking for, a man of the people. We're looking for this one thing, this one fell swoop. Yeah, that if I vote, everything will just magically come back to how it was. But the reality of it is that even if all of this happens, yeah, you're still going to need decades of hard work in order to unlearn, undo all the injustices that have been carried out since the 60s era. It takes time to build institutions. But then, Africa, if you just look at our history, we don't have a history of building institutions. Europe has, the Americans have, Chinese, the Asians have. But then when you look at Africans, it's been sort of, just a communal, just community organization. That's why people get so attached to, they get attached to ideologies, they get attached to, praying to God or doing anything except the hard work of actually building systems, infrastructure, things that work. And so what is happening right now, or is what will happen, is that these tough times will create the tough men that will dig us out of this shit. And so that's pretty much like what we can take home from this. We can look at this and we can say, okay, the situation is bad, but how can we leverage all the technologies and all the advantages that we have in order to actually do the hard work that is needed to become a Singapore, that is needed to become a Dubai, and so on. And I don't say this in the sense of that you should go out and try and help the world. And no. I mean it in the sense of, I'm just using it as an example, yeah? So that you can look at what to do in your personal life. I also don't believe in the fact that you should go around trying to change the world. The world is how the world is. I'm just using this as an example of how you now need to take care of your mind, your muscle, your money, all of that, acquire resources, because that's the world that you've been born into. If you were born in the soft times era, you would have had a different set of decisions than right now. So I guess to wrap it all up, where we are today is not a coincidence. There are no coincidences. There are only consequences. And it has been a consequence of all the decisions that have been made. But sadly, like I said, it might not be your fault, but it is your responsibility to try and figure out your own life, how to get ahead despite all of this. Then it's best that you actually get into the hard work, the difficult work of building our minds, building our money, building all of this so that we're stronger, we're tougher, physically, mentally, emotionally, financially, all of this. Because like I said, the notion that tough times will just disappear into thin air because of one magical messiah who will come into our lives and just change all of that is some African folklore shit that you should not listen to. Listen to the reality. Look at the reality of where we are in life and make your decisions based on that.